The night had settled hard over the prairie, pressing the little village into silence beneath a ceiling of dark clouds. A cruel wind came down from the hills, rattling shutters and dragging dry snow across the frozen earth. Folks in their cabins pulled quilts tight, lanterns dimmed, fires low. It was the sort of night where nothing living had any business being outside. Yet out there, in the swirling white, something small and fragile struggled against the bite of winter, something that should never have been left alone. The rancher was known by many names in the valley, and few of them were kind. He was a man, with wealth measured in cattle and land, but his heart seemed carved out of stone. People said he drank more than he spoke, that he raised his hand quicker than his voice, and that no man nor beast ever truly mattered to him. That night, he carried a bundle out beyond his ranch house, away from the warm light of his hearth, and left it in the snow as if it were no more than a burden he was eager to cast aside. No neighbor saw him. No family followed. Only the wind witnessed his deed, how the small cry of a newborn was swallowed by the storm. Across the ridge, a lone rider was making his way back from town. He was no ranch owner, no man with a family waiting, just a cowboy with a horse, a saddle, and the kind of weary eyes that had seen too much dust and distance. Folks hardly knew him. He kept to himself, working odd jobs, never staying long in one place. The town whispered about his quiet ways, but no one could fault his honesty. That night, when most men would have stayed put by the fire, he rode on, because men like him carried their burdens on the move. The storm thickened as he crossed the open stretch. Snow clung to his coat, stiffened his reins, and cut at his face. The sound reached him faint at first, too soft to belong to anything but the wind. He might have kept going if not for his horse's sudden halt, ears twitching toward the sound. He pulled back on the reins, listening. There it was again, a thin, desperate cry, carried through the dark. It was not the voice of a calf, nor the bark of a coyote. It was something more fragile, more haunting. He dismounted, boots sinking, into the drifts and moved toward the cry. The storm pressed heavy, each step harder than the last, but the sound drew him like a thread. At last, under the bent shadow of a cedar, he found the bundle. A blanket stiff with frost, trembling with the faintest stir of life. The cowboy's hands, rough from rope and rain, froze in place. He had seen death in many forms, but life this, small, abandoned to the snow, was something he had never come across. He crouched low, brushed the snow aside, and lifted the child. The newborn's face, red with cold, scrunched as another cry broke through the wind. For a moment, the cowboy simply stared. The weight was light in his arms, yet heavier than any he had carried. The storm raged on, biting through his coat, but all he could think of was the heat slipping away from the tiny body he now held. He looked back toward the dark line of the ranch house on the ridge, the lantern still glowing in the window. He could guess well enough where this child had come from. The rancher had a reputation, not just for cruelty toward men, but for a coldness that made even kin turn their faces away. The cowboy clenched his jaw, snow clinging to his beard. He had no family, no home, no place for something so fragile. And yet, to leave the child here would be to let death have its way before life had even begun. The horse stamped impatiently, its breath steaming in the cold. The cowboy tucked the baby close to his chest, feeling the tremor of its tiny heartbeat against his own. A man could ride past many things in his life, hunger, hardship, loneliness, but this was not one of them. Not tonight, he mounted with care, holding the bundle steady against him, and turned his horse toward the village. The snow was deeper now, the road nearly invisible, but he rode on with a fire in his chest stronger than any storm could put out. The wind screamed as though it meant to chase him back, but the cries in his arms kept him steady in the village. Lamps glowed faint behind curtains, the hush of sleeping families undisturbed by the struggle playing out beyond their doors. Number. One knew yet what had been done on that ridge. No one had seen the cruelty left in the snow. But soon the village would learn. And the lone cowboy, who had asked for nothing and carried only his own solitude, was about to carry something that would change not just his path, but the heart of the town itself. He tightened his hold, eyes fixed ahead, snow stinging his face. The child stirred weakly, a sound barely louder than the wind. He whispered low, words meant only for the little one, though perhaps also for himself. Words of promise, though he did not yet know what promise he could keep. The storm showed no mercy. The road into town grew longer with each mile, and his horse fought the drifts with heavy steps. Behind him, the ranch house light dimmed until it was swallowed by the night. Ahead lay the unknown, the whispers of townsfolk, the harsh judgment of the valley, and questions he was not ready to answer. Yet forward was the only way left. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence returned. The cowboy's thoughts turned heavy. He wondered what would happen come morning, when the child's cries would no longer be hidden by the storm. He wondered if the town would see this as a burden or as something greater. He wondered if he, a man with nothing, could protect something that had everything to lose. The snow fell thicker, the night deeper. The cowboy leaned low over the horse, the newborn pressed against him, and he rode on into the heart of the storm. The world seemed to hold its breath around him, waiting to see what a lone man would do, when fate had placed a life into his hands. And in that waiting silence, as the village came into sight, a shadow moved between the trees, watching him pass. The rider's shadow stretched across the snow as he entered the sleeping village. The houses sat low to the ground, chimneys breathing out faint wisps of smoke into the icy sky. Wooden fences leaned with age, barns creaked in the wind, and the single church stood tall, its steeple dusted white. The place looked as though it had folded itself into silence for the winter, each soul tucked away and guarded from the night. Yet the cowboy moved through it with the newborn cradled close, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as his horse pressed forward. He stopped by the blacksmith's shop, its sign swinging in the storm. No light glowed from within, though he could picture the man sleeping heavy near the warmth of his forge. He thought of knocking, but what would he say? He had no story to explain, no proof of where the child had come from. All he had was the truth, and the truth was dangerous here. Folks in these parts respected order, and the rancher who ruled the ridge had money and power enough to silence what he did not like. The cowboy knew this too well. He moved on, scanning the windows of each home, listening to the soft cry in his arms. The child was growing weaker, the tiny breaths sharp and shallow. He pressed the blanket tighter around it, feeling his heart pound with every faltering sound. Somewhere in this town there had to be a place that would take the baby in, but every door looked closed. Every light dimmed out at last. He reached the small general store that stood at the edge of the square. Its porch roof sagged, its windows clouded, but there was always someone awake there, tending to books or sorting goods. He dismounted and stepped onto the boards, snow clinging to his coat, the baby bundled close. He rapped softly at the door. The sound echoed too loud in the stillness, and for a moment he wondered if he'd made a mistake. The lock rattled, and the door cracked open, lantern light spilling out. A woman peered through, wrapped in a shawl, her face worn with years of labor but sharp with suspicion. "You know what hour it is?" she asked, her voice low and guarded. The cowboy shifted his weight, then loosened the blanket just enough for her to see the small face within. Her eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Good Lord," she whispered. She pushed the door open wider, motioning him inside. "Bring that child out of the cold before it freezes." The warmth of the store struck him at once, the scent of dried herbs and flour heavy in the air. Shelves loomed in shadow, filled with goods, while a pot simmered faintly on the stove. The woman hurried him toward the fire, pulling another blanket from a chair. "Whose is it? Where did you?" She stopped herself, eyes narrowing, then shook her head. "No, don't speak it now. Let the child breathe first." He crouched by the fire, holding the newborn close to the flame's glow. Tiny fingers twitched, lips trembling as warmth returned. The cowboy exhaled slowly, though his chest remained tight. He hadn't realized until that moment just how much fear had sunk into him. The woman laid a hand on the baby's forehead, then looked at the cowboy with sharp eyes. "I don't need to ask who would do such a thing. This valley's seen plenty of hard men, but only one cruel enough for this." She didn't speak the rancher's name. She didn't need to. The cowboy gave a small nod. Silence settled heavy between them. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, but inside, it was the weight of truth that pressed hardest. The woman sighed, then pulled the blanket tighter around the baby. "If word of this spreads wrong, it'll bring trouble. Folks fear that man too much to cross him, and he'll deny it quick as he breathes. You'll be marked for carrying this child." The cowboy leaned back on his heels, eyes steady. "Then let me carry the mark." Her gaze lingered on him, as though searching for something deeper. "You've no family here, no ties. Why would you risk it?" He didn't answer right away. He thought of the long roads he had ridden, the endless miles of dust and sky, the faces that blurred into memory. He had lived a life of leaving, never staying, never holding on. But now, with his small life pressed against him, leaving felt impossible. "At last," he said quietly, "because someone has to." The woman's shoulders softened, though her eyes still held worry. She rose and fetched a small bottle of milk she kept for trade, heating it near the stove. When she placed it in his hands, he hesitated, unsure, but she guided him, showing how to tilt it gently, how to watch the child take to it. The newborn's cries quieted as it drank, and for a moment a peace fell in the small store. Yet the peace was fragile. The woman knew it, and so did he. She spoke low, as though the walls themselves might carry word to the rancher. "You'll need to be careful. There are eyes everywhere. If he learns the child lives, he'll do worse than deny it. He'll make sure it vanishes for good. And he won't hesitate to cut down the one who stands in his way." The cowboy nodded, his jaw set. He had no illusions about the danger. He had seen men like the rancher before, men who thought land and cattle made them kings. But this was different. This was not about pride or power. This was about a life too small to defend itself. He stayed through the night in the store, the fire burning low as the storm raged outside. The woman dozed in her chair while he kept watch by the cradle she found for the child. Each small breath he heard was like a promise whispered back to him. By morning, the storm had eased, but the trouble was only just beginning. Word traveled quickly in a place like this, carried on whispers and half-glances. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, men at the saloon were already muttering. They had seen the lone cowboy ride in during the storm, a bundle in his arms. They had seen him slip into the store. And they began to wonder. The rancher, too, was watching. His men had eyes on every road, ears in every gathering. When word reached him, his face turned hard, his voice sharper than the whip he kept at his side. He asked no questions of where the child might be, he knew well enough. But he swore under his breath that no drifter would shame him, not in his own valley. Back in the village, the cowboy stepped out into the pale morning light, the child now resting in a borrowed cradle by the fire inside. His horse waited in the square, steam rising from its flanks. He looked down the road leading back toward the ridge, and he felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. Trouble was coming fast, carried not by storm this time, but by men. The townsfolk watched him too, their faces marked with a mix of curiosity and fear. Some pitied him, others judged, but most kept silent. They knew the rancher's reach, and they knew siding with a stranger meant risking more than whispers. The cowboy stood tall, though the burden on his shoulders pressed heavier than ever. He had no plan, no allies, only the fire in his chest and the cries he could still hear from the night before. Each step he took across the square felt like the start of something that could not be undone. Behind him, the woman's voice carried faintly from the store. "Careful where you ride, stranger. This valley eats the kind that stand alone." He did not turn back. He knew she was right. But he also knew he had already chosen his path, and it was one that would not let him ride away this time. Far off on the ridge, a rider mounted under the rancher's orders, spurring his horse hard toward the village. The snow was still thick, the road still rough, but the rancher's will was stronger than the weather. He wanted his secret buried, and he wanted it buried fast. The lone cowboy tightened his grip on his reins, sensing the storm that was now rolling on two legs instead of clouds. The village was waking, the air thick with whispers, but none of it mattered as much as the life he had carried out of the snow. The day had only just begun, but already the valley braced for what was coming. And in the heart of it all, a newborn slept, unaware of the battle that was about to rise over its fragile breath. The snow had stopped falling by midday, but the weight of the storm still hung over the village. Paths were carved into the drifts by boots and wagon wheels, smoke curled from chimneys, and yet the air seemed uneasy, as though the land itself sensed what was stirring. The cowboy lingered outside the store, his horse shifting beneath him, the saddle creaking with each restless step. Inside, the newborn slept in the cradle by the fire, tended to by the woman who had opened her door in the darkest hour. He should have felt relief, knowing the child was safe for now, but his gut told him safety was only a thin veil waiting to be torn away. By the saloon, men gathered in tight clusters, their breath clouding in the cold. Some spoke low, cautious, while others let their words carry through the street. Stranger rides in during the storm, carrying something bundled close. Not hard to guess what it was, one said, his voice carrying suspicion. Another spat into the snow. That rancher won't stand for it. You mark my words, there'll be trouble before night. The talk spread like wildfire, feeding on fear and curiosity. In the church, the pastor knelt alone, his prayers quiet, but his thoughts restless. He had seen too much in this valley to believe things would settle cleanly. His mind wandered to the cowboy, a man without ties, a drifter with no name to protect, and the child who now lay in the store. The pastor knew the cruelty of the rancher on the ridge, but he also knew the silence of a town too afraid to speak. He folded his hands tighter, asking for strength, though he wasn't sure whose hands would need it more. Out on the ranch, the cruel man sat in his wide chair, the fire snapping behind him. His glass was half full, his jaw set tight. He didn't shout when the news came, didn't slam his fist as some expected. He only narrowed his eyes, the lines of his face cut deeper by the glow of the flames. He thinks he can parade that brat through my town? He muttered, more to himself than to the men who stood before him. Bring him to me. His men nodded, eager to please, though a shadow of unease lingered in their eyes. Even those who worked under him knew there was a line between loyalty and fear. The cowboy, meanwhile, walked the length of the village, his boots crunching the packed snow. Every face he passed seemed to hold a question. Some mothers clutched their children closer, some men tipped their hats but quickly turned away, and some simply stared. He had lived long enough to recognize the weight of judgment. But what burned heavier in him was the memory of the newborn's cry in the storm. That sound was carved into him now, and no amount of whispers could scrape it away. He returned to the store just as the baby stirred. The woman rocked the cradle gently, humming low, though her eyes darted to the door with each creak of the boards. "They're already talking," she said without looking up. "This valley don't take kindly to trouble, and you've brought the biggest kind there is." The cowboy stepped closer, his hand brushing the worn wood of the cradle. "I didn't bring it." He left it. She looked at him then, the sharpness in her gaze cutting deep. "And yet it'll be you they blame. That's the way of things here." The child whimpered, and he reached out without thinking, steadying the small blanket. The woman studied him quietly, as if measuring whether he had the strength for what. Lay ahead. By evening, riders appeared on the ridge. Dark shapes against the fading light, their horses kicking up snow as they descended. Word spread quickly through the town, shutters closing, doors bolted. Folks didn't need to be told who they rode for. The rancher's men had a look about them, hard eyes, rough hands, and the weight of a man's order behind them. The cowboy stood in the square as the riders drew near, his shoulders squared, though his heart pounded in his chest. He had faced men before on trails, in saloons, across dusty plains, but this was different. This wasn't a fight over cards or cattle. This was something that could not be measured by coin or pride. Riders pulled up, snow spraying from their horses' hooves. Their leader, a broad man with a scar down his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "Rancher wants what's his," he said flatly, though his eyes flicked with something uncertain. The cowboy didn't move. "He left it in the snow. Don't look to me for what he threw away." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't reach for his gun, not yet. "You think you know what you're standing against? That child ain't yours, stranger. You've no right to it." The cowboy's hand hovered near his belt, but he didn't draw. "No right? Maybe not. But I've got the will. That's enough." The silence stretched long, the air so cold it bit at their lungs. Then, slowly, the riders turned their horses, the scarred man glancing back only once. "This ain't finished," he muttered, and the pounding of hooves echoed as they rode back toward the ridge. The townsfolk watched from behind their curtains, hearts racing. Some whispered of courage, others of foolishness. But all knew the rancher would not let the matter rest. That night, the cowboy kept watch by the cradle again, the fire low, shadows stretching long across the walls. He thought of the men on the ridge, of the power that weighed down this valley like a chain, and he wondered how long he could stand against it. Yet each time the child stirred, each time he heard that faint breath, his resolve tightened. Elsewhere in the town, new threads of conflict began to weave. The blacksmith, once loyal to the rancher for steady work, found his hands trembling as he hammered the forge. He had a daughter not much older than the child, and the thought of what had been left in the snow gnawed at him. The pastor, pacing in the church, wrestled with whether to speak out on Sunday, knowing full well that words could stir either salvation or ruin. Even the men in the saloon, usually quick to side with power, argued in hushed tones, their mugs of whiskey forgotten. Some thought the cowboy a fool, others saw a spark they hadn't felt in years. And up on the ridge, the rancher planned. He was not a man to be defied, and the idea that a stranger had dared to stand against him festered like a wound. He spoke to his men with quiet venom, his voice carrying the promise of retribution. "If the town won't hand him over, then we'll make them. Fear keeps them loyal. Remind them of it." The stage was set, though no one in the valley knew how the first blow would fall. The cowboy could feel it in his bones, the storm building again, not in the sky, but in the hearts of men. He sat by the fire, eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet his hand never strayed far from the pistol at his side. The child slept, innocent, to the weight pressing down from all sides, but every cry it made seemed to echo louder than a gunshot. By dawn, the town was restless. Men whispered of what might come, Women clutched their children closer, and every sound of hoofbeats made hearts jump. The cowboy stepped outside once more, the horizon pale with light, and he felt the eyes of the village upon him. Some looked with fear, some with hope, but all waited to see what a single man could do against the cruelty of one who ruled the valley. And in the distance, where the hills met the sky, riders gathered again. This time, there were more of them. Riders gathered on the ridge looked darker than storm clouds. Their silhouettes stretched long across the snow as the sun crawled low, staining the valley in pale light. There were more men now, twice the number from before, their horses restless, breath steaming in the bitter air. From the village below, folks could see them shifting in their saddles, and though no shot had been fired yet, the weight of violence already hung heavy. Windows shut tight, doors locked, yet every crack in a shutter held an eye. The people of the valley were waiting, hearts pounding with the knowledge that something was about to break. The cowboy stood in the square, boots planted in the frozen ground, his hand never far from the pistol at his side. He had not slept more than an hour through the night, the child's cries and the whisper of danger keeping him awake. Inside the store, the baby lay in the cradle, warm for now though, fragile as glass. The woman who had helped him moved briskly about her shop, her face tight with worry, her ear tuned to every sound from outside. She said little to him that morning, but the weight in her eyes told him enough. She knew what was coming, and she feared the town would not stand with him when it did. The saloon was alive with mutters. Men argued in low voices, mugs clinking, boots scraping against the floor. Some said the cowboy had no right, that he should hand the child over before the rancher's wrath burned the valley to ash. Others, quieter but firm, said it was time. Someone stood against the cruelty on the ridge. The blacksmith's voice carried louder than most. If we turn our heads this time, we'll never raise 'em again. That man's ruled us long enough. But even his words faltered when faced with the memory of the rancher's reach. The pastor walked the length of the church aisle, his hands clasped, his lips moving in prayer that had less to do with heaven than with the courage of men. He looked out through the frosted glass toward the square where the cowboy stood alone, and he wondered if perhaps this stranger had been sent not by chance, but by necessity. Still, he knew faith did not stop bullets, and the thought weighed him down. Up on the ridge, the rancher himself rode out at last. He was broad-shouldered despite his years, his coat heavy with fur, his eyes colder than the snow around him. He did not shout, did not wave his arms, but the men who rode with him sat straighter when he came near. He carried himself like a man certain of victory, as though the valley were already his to command. And in truth, for years it had been. In truth, for years it had been. Cowboy saw him from below, the figure he had imagined in the firelight the night before now real against the pale horizon. His jaw tightened, but he did not flinch. He knew this was not a fight about him, not truly. It was about power, about cruelty, about a child whose life had been deemed worthless by the man who should have protected it. The cowboy's pulse hammered steady, his breath clouding in the cold, but inside his chest a fire burned hotter than fear. The rancher and his men descended slow, the sound of hooves like a drumbeat rolling toward the village. Folks scattered back into their homes, slamming shutters, but they did not look away. Not this time. The square, empty but for the cowboy, became a stage. Snow crunched as the first of the riders reached the edge, their eyes fixed on him, there. Hands hovering near their guns, the rancher reined his horse to a halt, his shadow falling long across the ground. His voice was calm, but it carried sharp as a whip. "You've taken something that belongs to me." The cowboy raised his head, his voice steady though his heart thudded in his chest. "You left it in the snow. A man don't leave what's his to die. A murmur rippled through the riders, some shifting uneasy in their saddles. The rancher's face hardened. "That's no concern of yours. You've no place in this valley. Hand it over, and perhaps you'll ride out with your skin intact." The cowboy's hand brushed the worn wood of the cradle inside the store in his mind, as if the weight of the child's tiny body still rested against him. He drew a slow breath. "I can't do that." The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Even the horses seemed to sense it, stamping nervously, their ears twitching. The rancher's eyes narrowed, the faintest twitch in his jaw betraying his anger. From the shadows of the saloon, the blacksmith stepped out, his hammer still in hand. He didn't come far, only enough to let the riders see him. From another corner, the pastor appeared too, his coat thin, his eyes resolute. One by one, a few others drifted out, not with guns drawn but with their presence, quiet but firm. They didn't stand beside the cowboy, not yet, but they didn't hide either. The rancher saw it, and his lips curled in something between a snarl and a smile. "You think these people will protect you?" "They won't. Fear's thicker than loyalty, stranger. They'll watch you die before they lift a hand." The cowboy said nothing, but his eyes held steady. He wasn't sure if the rancher was right. He wasn't sure if anyone in the valley would truly stand when it came down to blood. But he knew he would, and sometimes that was enough to spark a fire. The riders shifted closer, the scarred man from before riding up near the front, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The tension coiled tighter with every heartbeat. The people in their homes held their breath. The air in the square so still it seemed the world itself waited for the crack of the first shot. Inside the store, the baby stirred, letting out a faint cry that carried into the square. The sound was small, yet it cut sharper than steel. Every man in the saddle heard it, every woman behind her shutter heard it. The cry of life, fragile but defiant, filled the silence. The rancher's eyes darkened, his teeth gritting. "Bring it out," he snapped, his patience burned away. 2. Riders urged their horses forward, their boots hitting the snow as they dismounted. They moved toward the store, the sound of their spurs like knives in the cold. The cowboy stepped into their path, hand hovering near his gun, his body taut as a drawn bow. "You'll go through me first." The riders paused, not out of mercy, but out of the weight of the moment. Everyone knew that if one hand twitched, if one word cracked wrong, the square would erupt in thunder and smoke. The blacksmith tightened his grip on his hammer. The pastor clenched his fists. Behind closed doors, mothers clutched their children tighter, while men stared at their rifles hanging unused on the walls. The valley seemed to lean forward, caught on the edge of breath. The rancher raised his hand, the signal poised to unleash his men. His eyes locked on the cowboy, not with rage alone, but with something deeper, a hatred for the defiance he had never faced before. For years his word had been law. Now a stranger threatened that order, not with power, but with the simple act of saying no. Snowflakes began to fall again, light and silent, drifting through the tense air. The cowboy's fingers curled near the grip of his revolver, his breath steady, his eyes sharp. The baby cried once more, louder this time, as if demanding the valley choose its side. And with that sound hanging in the frozen air, the moment before violence stretched unbearably thin, the whole valley bracing for the break that was sure to come. The square was so still it felt as though time itself had stopped. Snow drifted gently down, soft and delicate, almost mocking the tension that held every man's hand near a trigger. The rancher's arm remained raised, his men waiting for the signal, and the cowboy stood firm in the path between them and the store. Inside, the baby's cries rang out again, fragile yet powerful, a reminder of what all this was about. For a breathless moment, the sound broke something deep inside the valley. The blacksmith stepped forward, hammer still in hand. His boots struck hard against the frozen ground, echoing through the silence. "No more," he said, voice rough but steady. "We've been to you long enough." His words cut like steel. And for the first time, the rancher's eyes flicked with doubt. The pastor moved next, his thin frame trembling, but his voice rising clear. "Life is not yours to cast away. Not his, not anyone's." Others followed, slow but certain. A few farmers edged into the square, their hats low, their faces grim. Women peered out from doorways, children clung to skirts. The crowd was not armed like the rancher's men, but they carried something heavier, the courage of choice. The rancher's sneer twisted into a snarl. "You think numbers change anything? You think I won't burn this valley to ash?" His voice cracked through the cold, but even his own riders shifted uneasily. The scarred man at his side lowered his eyes, his jaw tight. They had been paid to enforce fear, but standing before the gathered townsfolk, some wondered if fear alone was enough to keep their loyalty. The cowboy's voice rose then, calm yet sharp as a blade. "You can take cattle, land, money. You can rule through fear, but you can't silence this." He gestured toward the store, toward the sound of the baby crying. "That life you tried to throw away will outlive you, and these people know it." The rancher's hand twitched, the signal nearly given. But his men hesitated. Eyes flicked between him, the cowboy, and the villagers now standing firm. Loyalty wavered, and with it, the balance of power shifted like ice cracking beneath a heavy weight. The scarred man dismounted, his boots hitting the snow. His hand lingered near his revolver, but instead of drawing, he dropped it to his side. His voice was low, but it carried. "I didn't ride down this valley to shoot at children. I've done enough, I regret." His words struck the line of riders like a hammer. Two more dismounted after him, silent but sure. The rancher saw his grip slipping. Rage burned across his face, his eyes sharp with venom. He reached for his revolver, but before his hand could close around it, the cowboy drew. The sound cracked. Through the valley, a single shot slicing the silence. The rancher's weapon flew from his grasp, spinning into the snow. The bullet had struck clean through his hand, leaving him cursing, clutching at the wound. The tension snapped at once. His horse reared, his men froze, and the townsfolk surged closer, not with violence, but with the weight of unity. The blacksmith dropped his hammer into the snow, his chest rising heavy. The pastor stepped forward, his eyes fierce. Mothers pulled their children out into the light, no longer hiding. The rancher, once untouchable, now stood alone. He looked around, his power unraveling before his eyes. The fear that had once bent this valley to his will was gone, replaced by defiance. Even those still loyal lowered their heads, unwilling to fight for a man who had been willing to abandon his own blood. The cowboy lowered his gun but kept it ready, his voice steady as he spoke. "Ride out. Don't come back. Your rule here is over." The rancher's eyes darted from face to face, searching for a single flicker of loyalty. None came. With his wounded hand pressed to his chest, he turned his horse, spitting curses into the snow. His men followed, slow and uncertain, but none dared defy the shift that had taken place. They rode back toward the ridge, smaller somehow, shadows fading against the white. When the last of them vanished, the valley breathed again. Relief swept over the square, though it was mixed with shock. The cowboy slid his revolver back into its holster, his breath clouding in the cold. He turned to the store, where the baby's cries had softened into quiet. The woman stood in the doorway, the child in her arms, her face pale but steady. The townsfolk gathered, not with cheers, but with a solemn kind of awe. They had not cheered because they knew what had happened was not victory born of glory, but survival carved out of fear. The blacksmith stepped close to the cowboy, his voice rough. "You've done what we never could," stood against him. The cowboy shook his head. "It wasn't me. It was all of you. I only carried the weight long enough for you to see it could be lifted." The pastor's eyes softened. "And what of the child? What life waits now?" The woman held the baby closer, rocking gently. Her voice was quiet, but strong. A better one than what was left for it in the snow. She glanced at the cowboy, something unspoken passing between them. "We'll see to that." Days passed, and the valley slowly began to heal. The rancher's hold weakened, his power crumbling as his men drifted away, unwilling to serve a man who had lost both respect and fear. The land itself seemed lighter, the air easier to breathe. Farmers returned to their fields with less weight. On their shoulders, children played in the streets without looking over them, and the saloon filled with talk of change instead of whispers of dread. The cowboy stayed through it all, though he knew he was not meant for settling. He helped mend fences, carried supplies, and stood watch as the village found its footing again. At night, he sat near the fire in the store, listening to the baby's soft breaths, and he felt something he had not felt in years' peace. The blacksmith's daughter often came by, peering into the cradle, her laughter filling the room. The pastor spoke words of hope on Sundays. His sermons no longer weighed with fear. Even the saloon grew warmer, its talk shifting from bitterness to plans for the future. Slowly, the valley stitched itself back together, yet the cowboy knew the time would come when his road would call again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow in gold, he saddled his horse. The woman stood at the door, the child in her arms, her eyes full of both gratitude and sadness. "You could stay," she said softly. He smiled faintly, his hat low over his brow. "Some men are made to ride, but I reckon this valley don't need me anymore." His gaze lingered on the baby, its small hand gripping her shawl. "That little one's got more guardians now than most ever see. That's enough." The woman nodded, tears glinting, but she did not stop him. She knew some souls were bound to the horizon. The cowboy mounted his horse, the leather creaking beneath him. The town gathered in the square, not to beg him to stay, but to see him off. The blacksmith raised a hand, the pastor bowed his head, children waved. The cowboy tipped his hat, his voice steady but kind. "Look after each other. That's how you keep a valley alive." He rode out as the wind picked up, snowflakes swirling around him, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Behind him, the village stood stronger than before, its people no longer bowed under fear. In the cradle of the store, the baby stirred, safe, warm, and watched over. And though the cowboy vanished into the wide horizon, his presence lingered in the hearts of the people. Not as a savior, not as a legend, but as the man who had reminded them that courage, once found, could never again be silenced. The valley carried on, no longer chained to cruelty, but bound instead by unity, by hope, and by the simple truth that, even in the harshest winter, life could endure if people chose to stand together. And so the story of the child in the snow and the stranger who would not turn away passed into memory, carried like a flame through the cold, a reminder of what it meant to rise when it mattered most,